The grand estate of Blackwell Manor stood like a monument to faded glory against the grey November sky, its imposing facade hiding the tragedy that had befallen its master. Once the centre of London's most glittering social gatherings, the mansion now lay shrouded in an almost sepulchral silence, broken only by the occasional footsteps of servants going about their duties with the quiet efficiency of those who understood that their world had fundamentally changed. In the master bedroom on the second floor, Duke Jonathan Blackwell lay propped against a mountain of pillows, his once powerful frame now gaunt and weakened by the mysterious illness that had struck him down 6 months earlier. At 34, he had been the epitome of masculine vitality, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes that had made him one of the most sought-after bachelors in England. His wealth was legendary, his influence in political circles unmatched, and his social standing so elevated that an invitation to one of his gatherings was considered the ultimate mark of acceptance in the ton. But illness, Jonathan had discovered, was the great equalizer that cared nothing for titles, fortunes, or social position. The affliction had begun subtly, a persistent fatigue that he had initially attributed to the demands of managing his vast estates and business interests. But as weeks turned to months, the exhaustion had deepened, accompanied by a weakness in his limbs that made even the simplest tasks monumentally difficult. The finest physicians in London had been summoned, each offering different theories but no definitive diagnosis, and certainly no cure. "It appears to be a wasting disease of the nervous system," Dr. Pemberton had pronounced, with the kind of grave authority that physicians adopted when they had no real answers to offer. Rest is essential. Complete rest, away from all excitement and stimulation. And so Jonathan had been confined to his bed, watching helplessly as his carefully constructed world began to crumble around him. The first to disappear had been the fortune hunters, those ambitious mothers with unmarried daughters who had once competed fiercely for his attention. When it became clear that the Duke's condition was serious and potentially permanent, their visits had ceased with remarkable speed. Next had come the fair-weather friends, those members of society who had basked in his reflected glory, but had no genuine affection for the man behind the title. They had made their excuses with practiced ease, pressing engagements, family obligations, urgent matters that required their immediate attention elsewhere. Even his business associates, men who had once hung on his every word and sought his counsel on matters of finance and investment, had gradually stopped calling. After all, what use was the opinion of a man who might never rise from his sickbed again? The final blow had come from Lady Vivian Ashworth, the beautiful widow who had been widely expected to become the next Duchess of Blackwell. She had visited exactly once after his diagnosis, her perfect features carefully arranged in an expression of appropriate concern. "My dear Jonathan," she had said, her voice carrying the kind of practiced sympathy that suggested she had rehearsed the words carefully, "I do hope you understand that I cannot continue our understanding under these circumstances. It would not be fair to either of us." The understanding she referred to had been their unofficial engagement, a relationship that had been the subject of intense speculation in society circles for months. Jonathan had been on the verge of proposing when his illness struck, and Lady Vivian's swift abandonment had been perhaps the most painful betrayal of all. Now, as he lay in his bed watching the grey afternoon light filter through the heavy curtains, Jonathan reflected bitterly on the lesson he had learned about the true nature of human loyalty. When he had been healthy and powerful, he had been surrounded by people eager for his attention, his approval, his favor. But illness had stripped away all pretense, revealing the shallow foundations upon which most of his relationships had been built. His only remaining companions were his servants, his valet, Hartwell, who had been with the family for over 20 years, Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper who managed the household with quiet efficiency, and Dr. Morrison, the young physician who had replaced the more illustrious doctors when it became clear that his condition was likely to be long-term rather than acute. The irony was not lost on Jonathan that the people who remained loyal to him were those who were paid to do so, while those who had claimed to care for him personally had vanished at the first sign of genuine adversity. A soft knock at the door interrupted his melancholy reflections, and he looked up to see Hartwell entering with the afternoon post. "Is your grace?" the elderly valet said with the kind of formal dignity that never wavered regardless of circumstances. "There are several letters for your attention." Jonathan accepted the small stack of correspondence with hands that trembled slightly. Another reminder of how much his condition had weakened him. Most of the letters were business matters that could be handled by his steward. But one envelope caught his attention. The handwriting was unfamiliar, feminine, and the paper was of good quality but not ostentatious. He opened it carefully, his curiosity piqued by this unexpected communication. "Your Grace, I hope you will forgive the presumption of an unsolicited letter from someone who has not had the honor of a formal introduction. My name is Miss Prudence Holloway, and I am writing to inquire about your health and to offer what assistance I might be able to provide during your convalescence. I understand that you have been confined to your bed for several months, and I thought you might appreciate some company during what must be a very difficult and isolating time. I am not seeking any social advantage or personal gain from this offer. Indeed, as a confirmed spinster of 8 and 20, I have no expectations of marriage or advancement that could be served by such an acquaintance. I simply believe that no one should have to face illness and recovery alone, and I would be honored to read to you, assist with correspondence, or simply provide conversation if you would find such companionship welcome. If this offer is of interest to you, please have your servant send word and I will call at your convenience. With sincere regards and hopes for your recovery, Miss Prudence Holloway." Jonathan read the letter twice, his initial surprise giving way to a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Miss Prudence Holloway, the name was vaguely familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have heard it. Her offer was certainly unprecedented. In his experience, unmarried ladies did not volunteer to spend time alone with gentlemen, particularly not gentlemen confined to their bedrooms, and yet there was something about the straightforward honesty of her letter that intrigued him. She made no attempt to flatter or ingratiate herself, offered no false sympathy or empty platitudes. She simply acknowledged his situation and offered practical assistance with a directness that was refreshing after months of carefully worded excuses and polite rejections. "Hartwell," he called, and the valet appeared immediately, as if he had been waiting just outside the door. "Yes, Your Grace? And what do you know of a Miss Prudence Holloway?" Hartwell's expression brightened slightly, the first genuine animation Jonathan had seen from him in weeks. "Miss Holloway, Your Grace? She's the daughter of the late Reverend Holloway, who served the parish of St. Mary's for over 30 years, a most respectable lady, known for her charitable works and her devotion to caring for the sick and elderly. And she's unmarried?" "Yes, Your Grace. Miss Holloway has devoted herself to caring for her invalid mother and to various charitable endeavors. She's widely respected in the community, though perhaps not well known in the highest social circles." Jonathan considered this information, his curiosity about Miss Holloway growing stronger. A clergyman's daughter with a reputation for caring for the sick would certainly have the skills and temperament to assist someone in his condition, and her claim to be a confirmed spinster suggested that she was unlikely to have ulterior motives regarding marriage or social advancement. "Send word to Miss Holloway," he decided. "Tell her that I would be grateful for her company and assistance, and ask when it would be convenient for her to call." "Very good, Your Grace," Hartwell replied, and Jonathan thought he detected a note of approval in the elderly man's voice. As Hartwell departed to send the message, Jonathan found himself looking forward to something for the first time in months. The prospect of conversation with someone who had no agenda beyond simple human kindness was more appealing than he would have thought possible. He had no idea that Miss Prudence Holloway's arrival at Blackwell Manor would change not only the course of his recovery, but the entire trajectory of his life. The spinster's arrival. Miss Prudence Holloway stood before the imposing entrance of Blackwell Manor, her heart beating with a mixture of nervousness and determination that she was careful not to let show in her expression. At 28, she had long since accepted her status as a confirmed spinster, a woman who had missed her chance at marriage and settled into the comfortable, if somewhat lonely role of caring for others. She was not, by any conventional standard, a beauty. Her brown hair was always neatly arranged, but lacked the lustrous curls that fashion demanded. Her grey eyes were intelligent but not striking, and her figure was pleasant but unremarkable. More damaging to her matrimonial prospects than her appearance, however, was her forthright manner, and her tendency to speak her mind on subjects that ladies were supposed to find too delicate for discussion. But what Prudence lacked in conventional feminine appeal, she more than made up for in practical skills and genuine compassion. Years of caring for her invalid mother had taught her patience, efficiency, and the kind of quiet strength that was invaluable in a sickroom. Her work with the parish's charitable organizations had given her experience in dealing with people from all walks of life, and her extensive reading had provided her with the kind of broad knowledge that made her an engaging conversationalist. The idea of offering her services to the Duke of Blackwell had come to her during one of her visits to the village, where the gossip had been full of speculation about his Grace's condition and the shocking speed with which his former friends and admirers had abandoned him. "Shameful it is," Mrs. Whitmore, the baker's wife, had declared with obvious indignation, "that all those fine ladies and gentlemen who were so eager for his attention when he was well, and now not one of them can be bothered to call on him in his time of need. Perhaps they're afraid of catching whatever he has," Mrs. Fletcher had suggested, though her tone suggested she didn't believe her own words. "More likely they're afraid of being associated with someone who might not recover," Prudence had observed quietly, her comment drawing surprised looks from the other women. "Miss Holloway," Mrs. Whitmore had exclaimed, "surely you don't mean to suggest that His Grace's friends would abandon him for such selfish reasons?" "I mean to suggest exactly that," Prudence had replied with the kind of blunt honesty that had earned her a reputation for being somewhat too outspoken for a lady. "In my experience, people are often quick to offer friendship when it costs them nothing, but remarkably scarce when genuine sacrifice is required." The conversation had stayed with Prudence for days, and the more she thought about the Duke's situation, the more troubled she became. She had never met His Grace personally. Their social circles were far too different for such an acquaintance, but the idea of anyone facing serious illness alone seemed fundamentally wrong to her, and so she had written her letter, fully expecting it to be ignored or politely declined. The Duke's positive response had surprised her, but it had also filled her with a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for some time. Now, as she stood before the massive oak doors of Blackwell Manor, Prudence took a deep breath and reminded herself that she was here to provide practical assistance, not to indulge in romantic fantasies about the mysterious Duke she had never met. The door was opened by an elderly man in impeccable livery, who could only be the valet Hartwell that the Duke had mentioned in his response to her letter. "Miss Holloway," he said with a bow that was perfectly respectful while managing to convey genuine warmth. "His Grace is expecting you, if you would be so kind as to follow me." Prudence followed Hartwell through corridors, lined with portraits of previous Dukes of Blackwell, their painted eyes seeming to watch her progress with expressions ranging from stern disapproval to mild curiosity. The house was magnificent, but felt oddly empty, as if it were waiting for life to return to its grand rooms. "His Grace is in his private study today," Hartwell explained as they climbed the main staircase. Dr. Morrison felt that a change of scenery might be beneficial, provided he remains seated and avoids any exertion. "That sounds very sensible," Prudence replied. "How is His Grace's spirits?" Hartwell paused for a moment, as if considering how much he should reveal to this stranger. "His Grace has been understandably low, Miss Holloway. The isolation has been difficult for him, as has the realization that many of those he considered friends were perhaps not as loyal as he had believed." "I see," Prudence said quietly. Well, I hope I can provide some small measure of companionship and assistance." "I believe you can, Miss Holloway," Hartwell replied with conviction. "His Grace has seemed more animated since receiving your letter than he has in weeks." They reached the study, and Hartwell knocked gently before opening the door. "Miss Prudence Holloway, Your Grace." Prudence entered the room and received her first glimpse of the Duke of Blackwell, and she was immediately struck by how different he was from what she had expected. The man seated in the leather chair by the window was obviously ill. His face was gaunt, his once powerful frame diminished by months of inactivity, but his blue eyes were alert and intelligent, and there was something in his expression that suggested a strength of character that illness had not been able to touch. "Miss Holloway," he said, attempting to rise from his chair. "Please, Your Grace, don't exert yourself on my account," Prudence said quickly, moving forward to take the chair across from him. "I'm honored that you agreed to see me." "The honor is mine," Jonathan replied, studying her face with the kind of direct attention that made Prudence suddenly self-conscious about her plain appearance. "I must admit I was curious about the lady who would offer assistance to a virtual stranger. Perhaps because I understand what it's like to be overlooked by society," Prudence replied with characteristic honesty. "As a spinster of limited means and no particular beauty, I'm quite familiar with being invisible to most people. I thought you might appreciate the company of someone who has no ulterior motives." Jonathan was taken aback by her directness, but also intrigued by it. In his experience, people, particularly women, rarely spoke so honestly about their circumstances or motivations. "You underestimate yourself, Miss Holloway," he said gently. "Your letter showed both intelligence and compassion, qualities that are far rarer than conventional beauty." "You're very kind," Prudence replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. But I prefer honesty to flattery. It makes relationships much simpler. I couldn't agree more, as Jonathan said, with the first genuine smile he had managed in months. Honesty has become rather precious to me lately, given how rare it seems to be. I imagine your illness has taught you a great deal about the true nature of the people around you, Prudence observed. Indeed it has, Jonathan replied, his expression growing more serious. I've learned that friendship based on advantage is no friendship at all, and that loyalty is a much rarer commodity than I had previously believed. But surely not everyone has abandoned you, Prudence asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. My servants have remained loyal, Jonathan said with a bitter smile, though I suppose they're paid to do so. As for my friends, my business associates, my romantic interests, they have all found pressing reasons to be elsewhere. Prudence felt a surge of anger at the callousness of people who could abandon someone in their time of greatest need, but she kept her expression neutral. Their loss, as she said simply, and perhaps your gain in that you now know who they truly are. "A rather expensive education," Jonathan observed, "but a valuable one," Prudence countered. "Now you can build relationships based on genuine affection rather than mutual advantage." "Assuming I recover enough to build relationships at all," Jonathan said quietly. "You will recover," Prudence said with such conviction that Jonathan looked at her in surprise. "Perhaps not completely, perhaps not quickly, but you will recover. I've seen it before. The human spirit is remarkably resilient when it has something to fight for." "And what should I fight for?" Jonathan asked, genuinely curious about her answer. "For the chance to live differently than you did before," Prudence replied without hesitation. "For the opportunity to surround yourself with people who value you for who you are, rather than what you can do for them. For the possibility of finding genuine happiness, rather than mere social success." Jonathan stared at her, struck by the passionate conviction in her voice and the wisdom in her words. This plain spinster, this woman who claimed to be invisible to society, had just articulated something he had been struggling to understand for months. "You speak as if you have experience with such transformations," he said. "I do," Prudence replied. "When my mother became ill, I lost many of the acquaintances I had thought were friends. But I gained something more valuable, the knowledge of my own strength and the ability to find joy in simple things rather than social approval. And you think I can do the same?" "I think you're stronger than you know," Prudence said firmly. "And I think this experience, painful as it is, may ultimately lead you to a better life than the one you had before." They talked for over an hour, covering topics ranging from books to politics to philosophy, and Jonathan found himself more engaged and energized than he had been in months. Prudence was indeed an excellent conversationalist, with opinions that were thoughtful and well-informed, and she had the rare gift of listening as well as she spoke. When she finally rose to leave, Jonathan felt a genuine reluctance to see her go. "Miss Holloway," he said, would you consider making this a regular arrangement? I find your company restorative, and I would be honored," Prudence replied with a smile that transformed her plain features into something approaching prettiness. "Or shall we say 3 times a week to begin with? I don't want to tire you, but I think regular companionship would be beneficial." "In 3 times a week sounds perfect," Jonathan agreed. "And Miss Holloway, thank you. I had forgotten what it felt like to have a genuine conversation with someone who expected nothing from me but my company." "The pleasure was entirely mine, Your Grace," Prudence replied. "I look forward to our next meeting." After she left, Jonathan sat in his chair by the window, watching her small figure disappear down the drive, and realized that for the first time in months, he was looking forward to something. Miss Prudence Holloway might not be a conventional beauty, but she possessed something far more valuable: the ability to see past his title and his circumstances to the man beneath. And perhaps, he thought, with the first stirring of hope he had felt in months, that was exactly what he needed to begin the long journey back to health and happiness. Society's shock word of Miss Prudence Holloway's regular visits to Blackwell Manor spread through the local community with the speed and intensity of wildfire in a drought-stricken field. Within a week of her first call, every drawing room in the county was buzzing with speculation about the spinster who had dared to do what none of society's finest ladies had been willing to attempt. Lady Margaret Thornfield sat in her opulent morning room, her face a mask of barely concealed outrage, as she held court among her circle of similarly minded friends. At 45, Lady Margaret had appointed herself the unofficial guardian of social propriety in their corner of England, and the news of Miss Holloway's unconventional behavior had struck her as a personal affront to everything she held dear. "It's absolutely scandalous," she declared to her assembled audience, her voice carrying the kind of moral indignation that suggested she viewed herself as the last bastion of decency in an increasingly corrupt world. An unmarried woman visiting a gentleman in his private residence, spending hours alone with him in his bedroom, it's beyond the pale of acceptable behavior. "But surely the circumstances are rather extraordinary," suggested Mrs. Caroline Ashworth, a younger woman who had always been somewhat intimidated by Lady Margaret's forceful personality, but occasionally found the courage to voice a dissenting opinion. "His Grace is seriously ill, and from what I understand, Miss Holloway is providing nursing care and companionship during his recovery." "Nursing care?" Lady Margaret snorted with derision. "That's what trained nurses are for, Mrs. Ashworth, not unmarried ladies of supposedly good breeding. Mark my words, this Miss Holloway has designs on the Duke, and she's using his illness as an opportunity to compromise him into marriage." "Yeah, but Miss Holloway is 28 and has never shown any interest in marriage," protested Mrs. Elizabeth Fairfax, a gentle soul who had always harbored a soft spot for the quiet clergyman's daughter. "She's devoted her life to caring for others, and I believe her motives are genuinely charitable." "Cease charitable." Lady Margaret's laugh was sharp and unpleasant. "My dear Mrs. Fairfax, no woman remains unmarried by choice when she has the opportunity to become a duchess. This Holloway creature has simply been cleverer than most. She's waited until His Grace was vulnerable and isolated, and now she's positioning herself as his savior." "That seems rather cynical," Mrs. Ashworth observed quietly. "Perhaps Miss Holloway is simply a kind woman who saw someone in need and offered her assistance. Kind women don't spend unchaperoned hours in gentlemen's bedrooms," Lady Margaret replied firmly. "Whatever her motivations, her behavior is improper and reflects poorly on all of us. Someone needs to put a stop to this before it goes any further." Meanwhile, in another part of the county, a very different conversation was taking place in the modest parlour of the village rectory, where the current vicar, Reverend Thomas Whitmore, was discussing the situation with his wife over their afternoon tea. "But I must say I admire Miss Holloway's courage," Mrs. Whitmore was saying as she poured tea into delicate china cups that had been her grandmother's. "It takes real strength of character to do what's right, regardless of what people might say." "Indeed it does," her husband agreed, his weathered face creased with concern. "But I worry about the damage to her reputation. You know how people talk, and Miss Holloway has always been vulnerable to gossip because of her unmarried state." "Let them talk," Mrs. Whitmore said with uncharacteristic firmness. "Prudence Holloway has done more good in this community than half the so-called ladies who are criticizing her. If His Grace is benefiting from her care, then she's doing God's work, regardless of what the gossips might say." "I agree with you completely," Reverend Whitmore replied, "but I fear that Miss Holloway may pay a heavy price for her compassion. Society can be remarkably unforgiving toward women who step outside the bounds of conventional behavior." Then society needs to examine its priorities," Mrs. Whitmore said sharply. "What kind of world do we live in when showing kindness to the sick is considered scandalous behavior?" The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door, and Mrs. Whitmore rose to answer it, returning a moment later with Miss Holloway herself. Prudence looked tired but determined, her plain brown dress and simple bonnet, marking her as someone who had no pretensions to fashion or social status. "Miss Holloway," Reverend Whitmore said, rising to greet her with genuine warmth. "How good to see you. I trust His Grace is improving." "Slowly but steadily," Prudence replied, accepting the offered chair with a grateful smile. "His spirits are much improved, and Dr. Morrison believes that the mental stimulation of conversation is helping his physical recovery as well." "That's wonderful news," Mrs. Whitmore said sincerely, "and you must be very pleased with his progress." "And I am," Prudence agreed, "but I must admit I'm somewhat troubled by the attention my visits have attracted. I've heard that there's been considerable gossip about my behavior." Reverend Whitmore and his wife exchanged a meaningful look, and Prudence caught the silent communication between them. "I see that you've heard the gossip as well," she said with a rueful smile. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. An unmarried woman spending time alone with a gentleman is bound to cause speculation. The gossip says more about the people spreading it than it does about you," Mrs. Whitmore said firmly. "You're providing care and companionship to someone who needs it. There's nothing improper about Christian charity." "I appreciate your support," Prudence said quietly. but I'm concerned about the potential damage to His Grace's reputation. He's already been abandoned by most of his friends and acquaintances. The last thing he needs is to be associated with scandal. Has His Grace expressed any concern about the gossip? Reverend Whitmore asked. We haven't discussed it, Prudence admitted, but I'm sure he must be aware of it. Servants talk and news travels quickly in a community this size. That perhaps you should speak with him about it, Mrs. Whitmore suggested. Let him decide whether he's willing to endure gossip for the sake of your continued visits. I've been considering that, Prudence said, but I'm afraid that if I bring up the subject, he might feel obligated to end our arrangement to protect my reputation, even if he would prefer to continue. Says then you're in a difficult position, Reverend Whitmore observed, but I would encourage you to remember that you're doing important work. His Grace's recovery, both physical and emotional, may depend on the support you're providing. I know, Prudence said with a sigh, and I don't want to abandon him when he's making such good progress. But I also don't want to make his situation worse by associating him with scandal. Please, Miss Holloway, and Mrs. Whitmore said gently, May I ask you a personal question? Please, of course. Are your feelings for His Grace purely charitable, or is there something more involved? Prudence was quiet for a long moment, her grey eyes focused on her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I care for him, she admitted, more than I should, perhaps. He's intelligent, kind, and far stronger than he realizes. But I'm not naive enough to believe that anything could come of such feelings. We're from completely different worlds, and once he recovers, he'll return to his proper place in society, while I return to mine. Are you so certain of that? Reverend Whitmore asked gently. From what you've told us, His Grace has learned some valuable lessons about the true nature of friendship and loyalty. Perhaps his recovery will include a reassessment of what he truly values in life. And perhaps, Prudence said, though her tone suggested she didn't dare hope for such a thing. But even if that were true, the difference in our stations would make any deeper relationship impossible. A duke doesn't marry a spinster clergyman's daughter, regardless of how much his perspective might have changed. Stranger things have happened, Mrs. Whitmore observed with a smile, and love has a way of overcoming obstacles that seem insurmountable. I appreciate your optimism, Prudence replied, but I prefer to focus on what I can control. Right now, that means helping His Grace recover his health and his confidence. Whatever happens after that is in God's hands. As Prudence prepared to leave, Reverend Whitmore placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Miss Holloway, he said seriously, Rose, I want you to know that Mrs. Whitmore and I support you completely in what you're doing. Don't let the gossips discourage you from following your conscience and your heart. Thank you, Prudence replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Your support means more to me than you know. After she left, the Whitmores sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes before Mrs. Whitmore spoke. That young woman is in love, she said with certainty. And unless I'm very much mistaken, His Grace is falling in love with her as well. I believe you're right, her husband agreed. The question is whether they'll have the courage to acknowledge their feelings and fight for their happiness, or whether they'll allow society's expectations to keep them apart. For their sake, I hope they choose love, Mrs. Whitmore said firmly. They've both sacrificed enough for other people's opinions. Back at Blackwell Manor, Jonathan was indeed aware of the gossip surrounding Prudence's visits, though he had learned of it not from servants' chatter but from a most unexpected source. Lady Vivian Ashworth, the woman who had abandoned him so swiftly when his illness began, had paid him a surprise visit that afternoon. She had arrived unannounced, sweeping into his study with all the dramatic flair that had once captivated him, her beauty as stunning as ever despite the calculating coldness in her eyes. Jonathan, she had said, settling herself in the chair that Prudence usually occupied, I felt I simply had to come and see how you're progressing. You look much improved. Thank you, Vivian, Jonathan had replied coolly, making no effort to hide his surprise at her unexpected appearance. To what do I owe this sudden concern for my welfare? I've always been concerned, Vivian had protested, though her tone lacked conviction. I simply felt it was best to give you space to recover without the complications of emotional entanglements. Yeah, how thoughtful of you, Jonathan had said dryly. And what brings you here now? I've been hearing the most disturbing rumors, Vivian had said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering unpleasant but necessary news. About some woman who's been visiting you regularly, a spinster of no particular breeding or accomplishment. Miss Holloway has been kind enough to provide companionship during my recovery, Jonathan had replied, his voice growing colder. I fail to see how that concerns you. And Jonathan, darling, surely you must see how inappropriate such an arrangement is, Vivian had said, leaning forward with the kind of intimate gesture that had once made his pulse quicken. An unmarried woman spending unchaperoned hours with a gentleman. People are talking, and not kindly. Let them talk, Jonathan had replied firmly. Miss Holloway's reputation is spotless, and her motives are purely charitable. As are they? Vivian had asked with a knowing smile. Jonathan, you're a duke, even if you're currently indisposed. Do you really believe this woman has no designs on your title and fortune? I believe Miss Holloway is one of the few genuinely good people I've ever met, Jonathan had said, his anger beginning to show. Unlike some others I could mention, she didn't abandon me the moment my circumstances became difficult. Vivian had flinched at the barb, but she had pressed on. I understand that you're grateful for her attention, but surely you must see that continuing this association will damage both your reputations. As someone who cares about your welfare, I felt obligated to warn you. Your concern is noted, Jonathan had said with icy politeness, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs and choosing my own companions. Of course you are, Vivian had agreed quickly. I simply thought, that is, I hoped that perhaps now that you're feeling stronger, we might renew our previous understanding. The suggestion had been so transparently mercenary that Jonathan had felt a surge of disgust that surprised him with its intensity. I'm afraid that's impossible, Vivian, he had said firmly. My illness has taught me a great deal about the true nature of loyalty and affection, and I find that my previous understanding was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of your character. Vivian's beautiful face had hardened at the rejection, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a note of venom that revealed her true nature. I see that this Holloway creature has already sunk her claws into you, she had said bitterly. Well, don't say I didn't warn you when you discover her true motives. A woman like that doesn't pass up the chance to become a duchess without having a very specific plan. So I think this conversation is over, Jonathan had said, his voice carrying the kind of ducal authority that brooked no argument. Hartwell will see you out. After Vivian's departure, Jonathan had sat in his study thinking about her words and his own reactions to them. The woman he had once considered marrying had revealed herself to be shallow, calculating and cruel, while the woman society dismissed as a plain spinster had shown him more genuine kindness and understanding than he had ever experienced. The contrast was so stark that it forced him to confront a truth he had been avoiding. He was falling in love with Prudence Holloway. Not because she was beautiful, though he was beginning to see a quiet loveliness in her plain features, but because she possessed qualities that were infinitely more valuable than conventional beauty. She was intelligent without being condescending, kind without being weak, and honest without being cruel. She saw him not as a title or a fortune, but as a man, and she cared for his well-being without expecting anything in return. But even as Jonathan acknowledged his growing feelings, he was forced to confront the obstacles that stood in their way. The difference in their social stations was enormous, and while he might be willing to overlook such considerations, he knew that society would not be so forgiving. Prudence was already facing gossip and speculation because of her visits. How much worse would it be if their relationship became something more? And yet, as he thought about the possibility of returning to his old life, surrounded by people who valued him only for what he could do for them, Jonathan found himself unwilling to accept such a future. Prudence had shown him what genuine affection looked like, and he was no longer willing to settle for anything less. The question was whether she felt the same way, and whether they would have the courage to fight for their happiness, despite the obstacles that society would place in their path. As evening fell over Blackwell Manor, Jonathan made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. Tomorrow, when Prudence came for her regular visit, he would tell her how he felt, and ask her to consider the possibility of a future together. It was a risk that could cost him the one genuine relationship he had found, but it was a risk he was finally ready to take. The declaration, the morning of what would prove to be the most important conversation of both their lives, dawned grey and misty, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into one's very bones. Prudence made her way to Blackwell Manor with her usual punctuality, but there was something different about her demeanour, a tension in her shoulders, and a preoccupied expression that suggested her mind was wrestling with weighty matters. The truth was that Prudence had spent most of the previous night lying awake, thinking about her conversation with the Whitmores and the growing complexity of her feelings for the Duke. What had begun as a simple act of Christian charity had evolved into something far more complicated and potentially dangerous to her peace of mind. She had tried to tell herself that her feelings were merely the natural result of spending so much time with an intelligent, kind man who treated her with respect and genuine affection. But honesty, that quality she prized above all others, forced her to admit that what she felt for Jonathan Blackwell went far beyond charitable concern or even friendship. She was in love with him, completely and hopelessly in love, and the knowledge was both exhilarating and terrifying. Exhilarating because she had never expected to experience such feelings at her age, after years of accepting that romantic love was not to be part of her life. Terrifying because she knew that such love was doomed to remain unrequited, given the vast difference in their circumstances. As Hartwell led her through the familiar corridors to Jonathan's study, Prudence steeled herself for what she had decided would be their final conversation. The gossip about her visits was growing more vicious by the day, and she could no longer ignore the potential damage to both their reputations. It was time to end their association before it caused irreparable harm to the man she had come to love. "Miss Holloway," Jonathan said as she entered the study, and she was struck immediately by something different in his manner. He seemed more alert, more energetic than she had seen him since the beginning of his illness, and there was an intensity in his blue eyes that made her pulse quicken despite her resolve. "Your Grace," she replied, taking her usual seat across from him. "You're looking much improved today." "I'm feeling much improved," Jonathan agreed, though his gaze remained fixed on her face with an attention that made Prudence suddenly self-conscious. "In fact, I believe I have you to thank for that improvement. I'm sure Dr. Morrison's treatments have been far more beneficial than my simple companionship," Prudence replied, though she felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "Doctor, Morrison has been competent," Jonathan said, "but it's your companionship that has made the real difference." "Prudence? May I call you Prudence? You've given me something I didn't even realize I was missing." "What's that?" Prudence asked, though something in his tone made her heart begin to race. "Hope," Jonathan said simply. "Hope for a different kind of future than the one I had planned. Hope for relationships based on genuine affection rather than social advantage. Hope for the possibility of real happiness." Prudence felt tears prick at her eyes at the sincerity in his voice, but she forced herself to remember why she had come. "Your Grace, I'm glad that our conversations have been helpful to your recovery, but I'm afraid I must, Prudence, I'm in love with you," Jonathan interrupted, his words cutting through her prepared speech like a blade through silk. The declaration hung in the air between them, transforming everything in an instant. Prudence stared at him in shock, her carefully planned farewell forgotten in the face of this impossible, wonderful, terrifying revelation. That's not possible," she whispered finally. "Why isn't it possible?" Jonathan asked gently, leaning forward in his chair. "Because of the difference in our stations? Because society would disapprove? Because you think I'm confusing gratitude with love?" "Oh, all of those reasons," Prudence said, her voice growing stronger as she found her footing in this unexpected conversation. "Your Grace, you're a duke. I'm a spinster clergyman's daughter with no fortune, no connections, and no particular beauty. We live in completely different worlds." "Shall we live in the same world?" Jonathan corrected firmly. "The world where kindness matters more than title, where character is more valuable than fortune, where genuine affection is rarer and more precious than any jewel. You've shown me that world, Prudence, and I don't want to live in any other." "Yes, but society has already shown me its true face," Jonathan said with a bitter laugh. "The same people who would criticize me for loving you are the ones who abandoned me the moment I became inconvenient. Why should I care about the approval of people who have proven themselves to be shallow and faithless?" Because their disapproval could make your life very difficult," Prudence said desperately. "Jonathan, you don't understand what it's like to be an outsider, to be whispered about and scorned. I do understand, and I won't be the cause of your experiencing such treatment. And you don't understand what it's like to live surrounded by people who see you only as a title and a fortune," Jonathan replied. "I do understand, and I won't go back to that kind of existence. Prudence, you see me as a man, not as a duke. You care about my thoughts, my feelings, my recovery, not about what I can do for you or how association with me might benefit you. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Did I see you as a man because that's what you are?" Prudence said simply. "The title is just an accident of birth. It doesn't define who you are inside." Exactly," Jonathan said with satisfaction. "And that's why I love you. You see the truth of me, not the facade that society expects. Prudence felt her resolve wavering in the face of his passionate declaration, but she forced herself to remain practical. Even if your feelings are genuine, even if mine are similar, it doesn't change the reality of our situation. A duke cannot marry a woman like me without causing enormous scandal and damaging his position in society. Are your feelings similar? Jonathan asked, seizing on the one part of her statement that mattered to him. Prudence, do you love me? The question hung between them, demanding an honesty that Prudence had been trying to avoid. She looked into his blue eyes, seeing the hope and vulnerability there, and found that she couldn't lie to him. Yes, she whispered. God help me, yes, I love you. But Jonathan, love isn't always enough. Sometimes practical considerations must take precedence over personal feelings. And not this time, Jonathan said firmly, rising from his chair with more energy than he had shown in months. Prudence, I've spent my entire adult life making decisions based on practical considerations, on what society expected, on what would maintain my position and reputation, and where did it get me? Surrounded by people who cared nothing for me as a person, engaged to a woman who abandoned me the moment I became inconvenient. He moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that made her heart ache. You saved me, he said quietly. Not just from loneliness and despair, but from a life that was empty of everything that truly matters. You showed me what real love looks like, what genuine companionship feels like, what it means to be valued for who I am, rather than what I possess. I won't give that up, Prudence, I won't give you up, Bondi. But the gossip, the scandal, she will die down eventually, Jonathan said confidently. People love to talk, but they also love to move on to the next sensation. And in the meantime, we'll have each other. You make it sound so simple, Prudence said, though her resistance was clearly weakening. It is simple, Jonathan replied. And I love you, you love me, and we can choose to build a life together based on that love. Everything else is just noise. And if your friends, your family, your business associates reject you because of your choice, then they were never truly friends to begin with, Jonathan said without hesitation. Prudence, my illness taught me that most of the people I thought cared about me were only interested in what I could do for them. I'd rather have one person who loves me genuinely than 100 who only pretend to do so. Prudence looked into his eyes, seeing the absolute sincerity there, and felt the last of her defenses crumble. This man, this wonderful, kind, intelligent man, was offering her everything she had never dared to dream of. Love, companionship, a future together. Are you certain? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Are you absolutely certain that this is what you want? Because once we take this step, there will be no going back. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Jonathan said firmly. Prudence Holloway, will you marry me? The proposal was so simple, so direct, so completely without the elaborate ceremony that might have been expected from a duke, that Prudence felt tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. Yes, Jonathan, I'll marry you. When he kissed her, it was with a passion and tenderness that spoke of months of growing affection and the joy of finally being able to express feelings that had been carefully hidden. Prudence had never been kissed before, but she knew instinctively that this was how it was supposed to feel, like coming home, like finding the missing piece of oneself, like discovering that fairy tales could come true, even for plain spinsters who had given up hope of romance. I love you, Jonathan murmured against her lips. My darling Prudence, my salvation, my heart. And I love you, Prudence replied, marveling at how natural the words felt now that she was free to speak them. My dear Jonathan, my unexpected blessing, my everything. As they held each other in the quiet study, both of them understood that they were about to face a storm of criticism and social disapproval that would test their love and their resolve. But they also understood that they had found something rare and precious, something worth fighting for regardless of the cost. Their love story was about to become the scandal of the season, but it was also about to become proof that true love could triumph over social convention, that genuine affection was stronger than public opinion, and that sometimes the most unlikely matches were the ones that lasted forever. The spinster and the duke had found each other against all odds, and nothing society could say or do would change the fact that they were meant to be together. Love triumphant. The wedding of Duke Jonathan Blackwell and Miss Prudence Holloway took place on a crisp morning in early spring, 6 months after their engagement had sent shockwaves through London society. The ceremony was held in the small parish church of St. Mary's, where Prudence's father had served for so many years, rather than in one of the grand cathedrals that would have been considered more appropriate for a ducal wedding. The guest list was deliberately small, consisting primarily of those who had supported the couple through the storm of criticism that had followed their engagement announcement. Reverend and Mrs. Whitmore were there, of course, along with Dr. Morrison, who had become not just Jonathan's physician but a genuine friend. Hartwell and Mrs. Winters represented the household staff, who had remained loyal throughout Jonathan's illness and recovery. Notably absent were most of the members of high society who would normally have considered themselves entitled to attend such an event. Lady Margaret Thornfield had made her disapproval known in the most public way possible, declaring that she could not in good conscience witness such a degradation of the noble institution of marriage. Lady Vivian Ashworth had been conspicuously silent on the subject, though rumour had it that she was already pursuing another wealthy gentleman with the same single-minded determination she had once focused on Jonathan. But if the absence of society's elite was meant to diminish the joy of the occasion, it had quite the opposite effect. The small congregation was filled with people who genuinely cared about the bride and groom, people who understood that they were witnessing not just a wedding, but a triumph of love over convention, of character over circumstance. Prudence walked down the aisle on the arm of Reverend Whitmore, who had graciously agreed to give her away in the absence of her father. She wore a gown of ivory silk that had been her mother's, altered to fit her slender figure, and her brown hair was crowned with a simple wreath of spring flowers that made her grey eyes sparkle with happiness. She had never looked more beautiful, but it was not conventional beauty that made the small congregation catch their breath as she passed. It was the radiance of a woman who had found her true place in the world, the glow of someone who had discovered that fairy tales could come true even for those who had stopped believing in them. Jonathan stood at the altar watching her approach, his blue eyes bright with love and wonder. The month since their engagement had seen a remarkable transformation in him, not just physically, though his health had continued to improve steadily, but emotionally and spiritually as well. The bitter, disillusioned man who had been abandoned by society had been replaced by someone who understood the true value of genuine affection and was prepared to fight for it regardless of the cost. He wore his finest formal attire, but there was nothing of the haughty duke about him as he watched his bride approach. He was simply a man in love, waiting to marry the woman who had saved him in every way that mattered. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Whitmore began, his voice carrying clearly through the small church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Jonathan and Prudence in holy matrimony. This is not just a joining of two lives, but a celebration of love that has overcome every obstacle placed in its path." The ceremony proceeded with simple dignity, each word carrying special meaning for a couple who had fought so hard to reach this moment. When Jonathan spoke his vows, his voice was strong and clear, carrying the conviction of a man who had found his purpose in life. "I, Jonathan, take you, Prudence, to be my wife," he said, his eyes never leaving her face. "I promise to love you not just in times of health and happiness, but in times of sickness and sorrow. I promise to value your wisdom, cherish your kindness, and stand by your side regardless of what the world might say about our choice. You have shown me what true love looks like, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the gift you have given me." When Prudence spoke her vows, her voice was soft but steady, filled with the quiet strength that had first attracted Jonathan to her. "I, Prudence, take you, Jonathan, to be my husband," she said, her grey eyes shining with tears of joy. "I promise to love you not for your title or your position, but for the man you are inside, kind, intelligent, and brave enough to choose love over convention. I promise to stand by you through whatever challenges we may face, to support your dreams, and to remind you always that your worth comes not from what others think of you, but from who you choose to be." When Reverend Whitmore pronounced them husband and wife, the small congregation erupted in applause and cheers that seemed to echo through the ancient church. Jonathan and Prudence kissed with a passion and tenderness that spoke of months of growing love and the joy of finally being able to express their feelings without reservation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Whitmore announced with obvious satisfaction, "I present to you the Duke and Duchess of Blackwell." The title still felt strange to Prudence, but as she looked into her husband's eyes, she realized that what mattered was not the rank she had gained, but the love she had found. She was no longer Miss Prudence Holloway, the spinster who had been overlooked by society. She was the Duchess of Blackwell, but more importantly, she was Jonathan's wife, his partner, his equal in all the ways that truly mattered. The wedding breakfast was held at Blackwell Manor, in the same dining room where Jonathan had once entertained the cream of society. But the atmosphere was completely different now. Warm, genuine, filled with the laughter and conversation of people who truly cared about each other. Dr. Morrison raised a toast to the happy couple, his words carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed their entire courtship. To Jonathan and Prudence, he said, lifting his glass high, who have proven that the best love stories are not always the ones that follow society's rules, but the ones that follow the heart. May your love continue to grow stronger with each passing year, and may you always remember that you found each other when you needed each other most. As the afternoon wore on and the guests gradually departed, Jonathan and Prudence found themselves alone in the garden, where they had shared so many conversations during his recovery. The spring air was soft and warm, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the promise of new beginnings. "Do you regret it?" Jonathan asked, a question that had become something of a ritual between them. "Marrying a man who comes with so much social baggage?" "Never," Prudence replied without hesitation, leaning against his side with the kind of contentment that came from knowing she had made the right choice. "I regret that we had to endure so much criticism to get here, but I don't regret the destination for a moment." "And the gossips? The people who said you were a fortune hunter, who trapped a vulnerable duke into marriage?" Prudence laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the evening air. "They've been remarkably quiet since our engagement was announced. Apparently, when a duke publicly declares his love and insists on a quick wedding, it becomes rather difficult to maintain that he's been trapped against his will. Some of them are still convinced that you must have some sort of ulterior motive," Jonathan observed. "Lady Margaret Thornfield was heard to say that no woman could possibly love a man for himself when he happens to be a duke." "Lady Margaret Thornfield has clearly never experienced genuine love," Prudence replied, with a mixture of pity and amusement. "I feel sorry for her, actually. She's so convinced that all relationships are based on advantage that she can't recognize real affection when she sees it. And what about the people who said I was making a mistake, that I was throwing away my position in society for a woman who could never be a proper duchess? They'll learn," Prudence said confidently. "Or they won't, and we'll build our own society with people who understand that worth comes from character rather than breeding." Jonathan smiled, thinking of how much his life had changed since Prudence had first walked into his study with her offer of companionship. The man who had once measured his success by society's approval now found his greatest joy in the love of a woman who had been dismissed by that same society as insignificant. "I have something to tell you," Prudence said, her voice carrying a note of excitement that made Jonathan's attention focus entirely on her. "What is it?" "I'm with child," Prudence said simply, watching as joy and wonder spread across his features. "We're going to have a baby." Jonathan's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around in a circle before setting her gently back on her feet, his face radiant with happiness. "A baby," he repeated, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Prudence asked, though his expression left little doubt about his feelings. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Jonathan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm ecstatic, grateful, and more blessed than I ever thought possible. Our child will grow up in a very different world than either of us did," Prudence observed. "They'll be born into privilege, but they'll also understand the value of kindness, compassion, and genuine human connection. They'll learn that true worth comes from character rather than circumstances," Jonathan added, his hand moving instinctively to rest on Prudence's still flat stomach. "They'll understand that love is more important than social approval, and that the best relationships are built on honesty and mutual respect. And they'll know that their parents found each other against all odds and chose love over convention," Prudence said with a smile that lit up her entire face, as they stood together in their garden. Surrounded by the beauty of spring and the promise of new life, Jonathan and Prudence reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, Jonathan had been a bitter, isolated man, abandoned by everyone he had thought cared about him. Prudence had been a lonely spinster, resigned to a life of caring for others, while never experiencing love herself. But illness had brought them together, and love had transformed them both. Jonathan had learned that genuine affection was worth more than all the social approval in the world, while Prudence had discovered that even the most unlikely dreams could come true for those brave enough to pursue them. "What happens now?" Prudence asked, settling more comfortably against Jonathan's side as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Now we live," Jonathan said simply. "We raise our children to value character over convention, We use our position and resources to help others who are struggling or overlooked. We prove to the world that marriages based on genuine love are stronger and more lasting than those based on social advantage. And if society never fully accepts our unconventional beginning, then we'll create our own society, Jonathan replied with the kind of confidence that had first attracted Prudence to him. We'll surround ourselves with people who understand that the best love stories are often the most unexpected ones. Prudence smiled, thinking of the friends who had stood by them through the scandal, the servants who had remained loyal despite the gossip, the small but growing circle of people who valued authenticity over appearance. They had indeed created their own society, one based on genuine affection and mutual respect rather than superficial social climbing. "I love you, Jonathan Blackwell," she said, using his full name as she had on their wedding day. "Thank you for seeing past society's expectations to the woman I really am. Thank you for choosing love over convenience, truth over appearance, happiness over approval." "And I love you, Prudence Blackwell," he replied, her new name sounding like music on his lips. "Thank you for saving me from a life of empty relationships and hollow success. Thank you for showing me what real love looks like, and for being brave enough to fight for our happiness despite all the obstacles." 1 year later, the nursery at Blackwell Manor was filled with the soft afternoon light that filtered through curtains of pale yellow silk, casting a warm glow over the scene of domestic tranquility within. Prudence sat in a comfortable chair beside the window, cradling their 6-month-old son James, while Jonathan read aloud from a book of poetry, his voice soft and melodious in the quiet room. The transformation in both their lives over the past year had been remarkable. Jonathan had not only fully recovered his physical health, but had discovered a sense of purpose and fulfillment that had been missing from his previous existence. Under Prudence's influence, he had become deeply involved in charitable work, using his wealth and position to establish schools for poor children and hospitals for those who couldn't afford medical care. Prudence had blossomed in her role as Duchess, proving that true nobility came from character rather than breeding. She had won over even some of her harshest critics through her genuine kindness, her intelligence, and her obvious devotion to her husband and child. The woman who had once been dismissed as a plain spinster was now respected and admired by all who knew her. "He's going to be a reader," Jonathan observed, noting how their son's bright blue eyes seemed to focus intently on the book in his father's hands. "Look how he watches the pages." "He gets that from both of us," Prudence replied with a smile. "Though I suspect he's more interested in the sound of your voice than in the actual words at this point." "Perhaps, but it's never too early to start his education," Jonathan said, reaching over to stroke his son's downy, dark hair. "I want him to grow up understanding that knowledge is one of the most valuable gifts we can give him, along with love, compassion, and the courage to follow his heart regardless of what others might think," Prudence added. "Especially that," Jonathan agreed. "I want him to understand that the most important decisions in life are often the ones that seem the most impossible at first." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Hartwell, who entered with the kind of discreet cough that indicated he had news to share. "Your Grace," he said to Jonathan, "Lady Vivian Ashworth has called and is requesting an audience. Shall I tell her you are not receiving visitors?" Jonathan and Prudence exchanged a meaningful look. Vivian had made several attempts to renew her acquaintance with Jonathan since his marriage, apparently hoping that his newfound happiness might make him more receptive to her overtures. "No, Hartwell," Jonathan said after a moment's consideration. "I'll see her. It's time to make my position absolutely clear." "Are you certain?" Prudence asked, though her tone suggested she trusted his judgment completely. "I'm certain," Jonathan replied, leaning over to kiss both his wife and son. "Some conversations are long overdue." 15 minutes later, Jonathan sat in his study facing the woman he had once considered marrying, marveling at how completely his feelings had changed. Vivienne was as beautiful as ever, her golden hair perfectly arranged and her blue silk gown cut to show her figure to best advantage. But where he had once seen elegance and sophistication, he now saw calculation and artifice. "Jonathan," Vivian said, settling herself in the chair across from him with practiced grace, "you look wonderful. Married life clearly agrees with you." "It does," Jonathan replied simply. "I've never been happier." "I'm so glad," Vivian said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "And your son? I hear he's a beautiful child." "He is," Jonathan agreed, his face softening at the mention of his son. "James is perfect in every way." "I'm sure he is," Vivian said, then paused as if gathering courage for what she wanted to say next. "Jonathan, I hope you know that I've always regretted the way things ended between us. I was frightened by your illness and I reacted poorly. You reacted honestly, Jonathan replied without rancor, and I'm grateful for that honesty even though it was painful at the time. It helped me understand what our relationship was really based on. But surely you must understand that I was young and foolish, Vivian pressed. I've learned so much since then about what truly matters in life. Have you? Jonathan asked with genuine curiosity. And what have you learned? I've learned that love is more important than security, that loyalty matters more than social position, that genuine affection is worth more than any material advantage, Vivian said, the words flowing smoothly as if she had rehearsed them. Those are beautiful sentiments, Jonathan observed, and I'm sure you believe them. But Vivian, even if your feelings have changed, mine have as well. I'm deeply in love with my wife, and I have no interest in renewing any aspect of our previous relationship. Vivian's composure slipped slightly at his firm rejection. But Jonathan, surely you must see that your current situation is temporary. You married beneath your station in a moment of gratitude and isolation. Once the novelty wears off, you'll realize that you need a wife who can truly be your equal in society. I have a wife who is my equal in every way that matters, Jonathan replied, his voice growing colder. Prudence is intelligent, kind, principled, and brave. She loved me when I had nothing to offer but my company, and she continues to love me now that I can offer her everything. What more could I possibly want in a partner? But she can never be a proper duchess, Vivian insisted. She doesn't have the breeding, the connections, the social skills necessary for such a position. On the contrary, Jonathan said firmly, she's the best duchess I could have hoped for. She uses her position to help others. She treats everyone with respect regardless of their station, and she's earned the genuine affection of everyone who knows her. Those are the qualities of true nobility, Vivian, not the accident of birth or the ability to navigate social politics. Vivian stared at him for a long moment, finally understanding that her hopes of rekindling their relationship were futile. I see that she's completely bewitched you, she said bitterly. I only hope you don't live to regret your choice. The only thing I regret, Jonathan said as he rose to signal the end of their conversation, is that it took me so long to understand what real love looks like. Prudence didn't bewitch me, Vivian. She saved me. She showed me what it means to be valued for who I am, rather than what I can provide. After Vivian's departure, Jonathan returned to the nursery, where he found Prudence still sitting by the window with their son, now fast asleep in her arms. How did it go? She asked quietly. Exactly as expected, Jonathan replied, settling into the chair beside her. She offered to renew our relationship. I declined, and she left convinced that you've somehow bewitched me into making a terrible mistake. Have I? Prudence asked with a smile that told him she already knew the answer. Absolutely, Jonathan replied, leaning over to kiss her softly. You've bewitched me into believing that love is more important than social approval, that character matters more than breeding, and that the best decisions in life are often the ones that seem the most impossible at first. Those are dangerous ideas, Prudence observed with mock seriousness. The most dangerous, Jonathan agreed. They've completely ruined me for any other kind of life. As they sat together in the peaceful nursery, watching their son sleep and planning for their future, Jonathan and Prudence reflected on how much their lives had changed since that first day when she had walked into his study with her offer of companionship. They had faced scandal, criticism, and social ostracism, but they had also found something infinitely more valuable, a love that was based on genuine understanding and mutual respect, a partnership that made them both stronger and better than they had been alone. Their story had shocked society, challenged conventions, and proven that the most unlikely love stories were often the most enduring. The Duke, who had been abandoned by all, had found salvation in the love of a spinster who had been overlooked by everyone. Together, they had created a life that was richer and more meaningful than anything either of them had dared to imagine. I love you, Prudence Blackwell, Jonathan said softly, his voice filled with the same wonder and gratitude that had characterized their entire relationship. And I love you, Jonathan Blackwell, she replied, her grey eyes shining with contentment. My unexpected blessing, my greatest adventure, my heart. As the sun set over Blackwell Manor, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the Duke and Duchess of Blackwell sat together in perfect harmony, surrounded by the love they had fought so hard to protect. They had proven that true love could triumph over any obstacle, that genuine affection was stronger than social convention, and that sometimes the most beautiful endings came from the most unlikely beginnings. Their love story was complete, But their life together was just beginning, filled with the promise of children to raise, causes to champion, and a love that would only grow stronger with each passing year. They had found in each other not just romance but partnership, not just passion but purpose, and not just happiness, but the deep contentment that comes from knowing one has found their true place in the world. The spinster and the duke had defied all expectations to create something beautiful and lasting. A love that would inspire others to choose courage over conformity, hope over despair, and love over fear, no matter what obstacles might stand in their way. Did Jonathan and Prudence's journey from abandonment to unexpected love touch your heart? If this tale of a duke saved by a spinster's devotion moved you, please like this story and subscribe for more captivating Regency romances. Share this with someone who believes that true love sees beyond social status, and let us know in the comments which moment moved you most, Prudence's brave first visit or their triumphant wedding. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest romantic adventures.